This story is titled, I Rescued My Dad's Failing Company, Built a $150 million empire, and Faced My Brother's Betrayal. Hi, Reddit. Have you ever faced one of those moments where your entire life feels like it's hanging by a thread? That was me about 10 years ago. I was staring at a massive mess, not one I had created, mind you, but one I couldn't just walk away from either. Let me rewind and give you some context. My dad, Robert, was the kind of man you'd admire for his grit and determination. He built a company from nothing, a testament to years of sweat, hustle, and sacrifice. But while he was great at building things, managing finances wasn't exactly his strong suit. By the time I was 26, fresh out of business school, the company was teetering on the brink of collapse. And my dad? He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, visibly aged beyond his years. And then there was Ryan, my older brother. At 31, he was the textbook definition of the golden child. Ryan had charm in spades, the kind that could win people over effortlessly. But while I was buried in spreadsheets and trying to understand the intricacies of supply chains, Ryan was busy living his best life. Exotic vacations, high-end parties, expensive hobbies, you name it, Ryan was doing it. Somehow, despite all this, he remained Dad's favorite. Always had been. Always would be. It wasn't a new revelation. Ryan had always been the one who could do no wrong, but knowing it didn't make it sting any less. I had grown used to being overlooked, but the weight of that dynamic seemed heavier now, especially as I watched Dad struggle. One night I walked into Dad's office. It was late, and the place looked like a disaster zone. Stacks of unpaid invoices towered precariously on his desk, and contracts were scattered everywhere. It was as if someone had turned the office into a war zone of paperwork. Dad didn't even notice me walk in at first. He was hunched over, staring blankly at the chaos around him. Finally, he looked up, and I could see the exhaustion etched into his face. I think it's over, Josh, he said, his voice heavy. I don't know how to fix this. Hearing those words was like getting punched in the gut. This was the man who had taught me everything about perseverance and hard work, the man I had always seen as unshakable. And now, he was telling me he had reached his breaking point. Something inside me snapped. I'll take care of it, I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm not sure if he believed me. I wasn't even sure if I believed myself, but he didn't argue. If anything, he looked relieved, as though a part of him had been waiting for someone to step in. From that moment, I threw myself into the company. I practically lived at the office, diving headfirst into every single aspect of the business. I analyzed every process, pored over every financial record, and spoke to every client. Most of them weren't interested in hearing from me. To them, I was just some kid, inexperienced and desperate. Doors were slammed in my face, both literally and figuratively, more times than I can count. But I didn't give up. I couldn't. Slowly but surely, people began to notice. Even those who had dismissed me at first started to take me seriously. The first year was nothing short of grueling. I was working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, and it felt like the company's survival depended entirely on me. Dad officially stayed at the helm, but he handed over almost all decision-making to me. One of my first moves was cutting unnecessary expenses, and yes, that included Ryan's habit of charging personal luxuries to the company's account. Unsurprisingly, he didn't take that well. One day, Ryan strolled into the office, his trademark smirk plastered across his face. Look at you playing CEO, he sneered. Don't get too comfortable. Dad won't let you keep it. I didn't bother responding. I had grown used to his digs. Ryan had a way of taking credit for things he didn't do while dodging blame for his mistakes. But this wasn't about him. It wasn't even about earning Dad's approval. I was doing this because I couldn't stand the thought of letting everything my father had built go to waste. By the end of that first year, there were glimmers of hope. The company wasn't thriving yet, but we weren't drowning either. We had managed to stabilize. Clients who had once written us off were beginning to return. Employees who had feared for their jobs started to feel secure again. And for the first time in years, the company turned a modest profit. But of course, success didn't fix everything. Dad was proud of what I'd accomplished, but in his eyes, Ryan was still untouchable. At family dinners, while I was busy thinking about ways to expand the business, Dad would go on and on about Ryan's supposed business acumen. It stung to hear, but I learned to tune it out. I wasn't doing this for applause or recognition. My goals were bigger than that. I wanted to build something sustainable, something we could all be proud of. The decision to step in and take over the company was one thing. Actually doing it was a whole other beast. My initial optimism was quickly met with the brutal reality of how much work there was to do. This wasn't some small corner store operation. It was a mid-sized corporation with tangled financials, outdated systems, and dwindling morale. The deeper I dug, the more it felt like I was trying to bail water out of a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The first order of business was understanding where the money was going. And let me tell you, it wasn't a pretty picture. There were bloated contracts, inefficient processes, and an absolute lack of accountability. The cherry on top? Ryan's lavish spending. Every time I looked at the company's expense records, I found another one of his indulgences, a new golf club membership here, a vacation charged as a business retreat there. It was infuriating, but not surprising. Cutting those expenses was the easy part. The hard part was rebuilding trust with clients, employees, and even myself. Many of our clients had been burned by missed deadlines and broken promises. They weren't interested in hearing from me, the inexperienced kid who, in their eyes, was probably just as unreliable as the company I represented. But I refused to give up. I called, I emailed, I visited offices in person. I heard more no's than I ever thought possible. But every once in a while, I'd get a yes. Those small victories kept me going. Then there were the employees. They were understandably skeptical of me. Most of them had been around long enough to see the company's decline firsthand, and I think they saw me as just another temporary patch in a sinking boat. I needed to show them that I was serious. I started by meeting with everyone, from department heads to interns. I asked questions. I listened. And I made it clear that I wasn't just there to keep the lights on. I was there to turn things around. One of the most difficult but necessary changes was downsizing. It was heartbreaking to let people go, especially those who had been loyal to the company through thick and thin. But the reality was that we couldn't afford to keep everyone. I hated being the one to deliver the news, but I made sure to do it personally. I owed them that much. Each conversation ended with an apology and a promise to provide a glowing reference for their next role. At the same time, I worked to incentivize the remaining employees. Bonuses were out of the question, we didn't have the money, but I found other ways to boost morale. I started hosting regular town hall meetings where I updated everyone on the company's progress, no matter how small. I created an open-door policy so anyone could bring me their ideas or concerns. Slowly, I noticed a shift. People started believing in me, or at least in the possibility of change. Meanwhile, Ryan continued to make my life as difficult as possible. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back with him around. He'd show up at the office unannounced, cracking jokes about my late nights and early mornings. "You know, Josh," he said once, leaning against my office door, "you should really get a life outside of this place. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy." I ignored him, as I usually did, but it was hard not to feel the sting. Ryan had never worked a day in his life, not really. And yet he carried himself like he owned the place. And in Dad's eyes, he practically did. But I wasn't doing this for Ryan, or even for Dad. I was doing it because the company meant something to me. It was a symbol of my father's hard work, his legacy, and I couldn't let it crumble, not on my watch. About 6 months into my efforts, I started seeing real progress. We renegotiated several contracts, cutting costs significantly. I implemented new systems to streamline operations and brought in a consultant to train our sales team on best practices. The company wasn't just surviving anymore, it was starting to turn a corner. But with progress came new challenges. Ryan, sensing the company's revival, began showing up more frequently. He'd sit in meetings, nodding along as if he had been part of the turnaround all along. It was infuriating, but I held my tongue. Dad's blind spot for Ryan was something I couldn't change, no matter how much I wanted to. At home, things weren't much better. My friends stopped inviting me to hang out because I was always at the office. My social life was non-existent, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something just for myself. But every time I felt like giving up, I'd think back to that night in Dad's office. The look of relief on his face when I said I'd handle it. That kept me going. By the end of the year, the company had stabilized. It wasn't thriving yet, but we were in the black for the first time in years. Clients who had abandoned us were starting to return, and employees who had been on edge were beginning to relax. It felt like we were finally turning a corner. And yet, in the midst of all this progress, one thing remained constant. Ryan was still the favorite. No matter how hard I worked or how much I achieved, Dad always found a way to credit Ryan for our success. Over dinner, he'd talk about Ryan's natural leadership skills or his keen business sense, completely ignoring the fact that Ryan hadn't lifted a finger to help. It stung, but I kept my focus on the bigger picture. I wasn't doing this for recognition. I was doing it to prove, to myself if no one else, that I could take something broken and make it whole again. The start of the second year felt like climbing out of a trench. We weren't at the top yet, but we weren't buried anymore either. The company's reputation, once in tatters, was starting to recover. Clients who had once slammed the door in my face were now giving me a chance, not because they suddenly believed in me, but because they saw the results. Numbers don't lie, and ours were finally starting to look promising. With that momentum, I knew it was time to tackle bigger challenges. The company needed a complete overhaul, not just cosmetic changes. I started pushing for modernization, which wasn't easy. Dad was resistant to the idea of replacing older systems. He saw them as a part of the company's history, a relic of the hard work he'd put in over the years. But history doesn't pay the bills, and if we wanted to stay competitive, we had to adapt. Dad, the market's evolving, I explained during one of our late-night conversations. If we don't evolve with it, we're going to fall behind. Again. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I built this place with these systems, Josh. They've gotten us this far. And they almost drove us into the ground, I said, more bluntly than I intended. It's not about disrespecting the past. It's about securing the future. Eventually, he relented. We started implementing new technologies, from updated software to streamlined communication tools. It was an expensive and time-consuming process, but I knew it was worth it. Slowly, our efficiency improved, and so did our profit margins. On the employee front, morale continued to climb. I introduced new policies aimed at making people feel valued, things like flexible work hours, recognition programs, and team-building events. They weren't grand gestures, but they made a difference. For the first time in years, people seemed genuinely excited to come to work. Of course, not everyone was on board. Ryan, for one, had no interest in anything remotely productive. His visits to the office became more frequent, and with each one, it felt like he was trying to assert his presence. He'd walk around like he owned the place, throwing out half-baked ideas and demanding updates on projects he had no involvement in. Why are we spending so much on this tech upgrade? He asked during one meeting, leaning back in his chair like he was the boss. Seems like a waste of money to me. I took a deep breath, resisting the urge to snap. It's an investment, Ryan. If we don't modernize, we're going to lose clients. The numbers are clear. He shrugged. If you say so, just don't screw it up. It wasn't just Ryan's attitude that grated on me. It was the way Dad let him get away with it. No matter what Ryan did or didn't do, he was always the golden boy. And as much as I tried to ignore it, there were moments when the favoritism felt like a slap in the face. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day, I was having dinner at Dad's house. The conversation turned, as it often did, to Ryan. Ryan's got a good head for business, Dad said, between bites of his steak. I think he could really bring something to the company. I stared at him, dumbfounded. Dad, Ryan hasn't contributed anything. He doesn't even understand how the company works. That's not fair, Dad replied. He has ideas. He just needs the right guidance. I bit my tongue, knowing it was pointless to argue. If Dad wanted to see Ryan as a business genius, nothing I said was going to change his mind. Despite the challenges, I stayed focused on my goals. My vision for the company was bigger than any one person's opinion, even Dad's. I wanted to build something that could stand the test of time, something that could weather storms and still come out stronger on the other side. And for a while, it felt like we were getting there. Revenue continued to climb, and we started expanding into new markets. I negotiated partnerships that opened doors we'd never even considered before. The company was no longer just surviving. It was thriving. But with success came new complications. As the business grew, so did Ryan's interest in it. He started attending more meetings, making more appearances, and acting like he was an integral part of the operation. Everyone knew better, of course, but no one dared to call him out. Not even me. I couldn't risk creating tension that might derail everything we'd worked so hard to achieve. Looking back, I realized that was the first sign of trouble. Ryan didn't like being overshadowed, and as the company's success became more visible, so did my role in it. He'd make little digs during meetings, jokes disguised as criticism. Don't work too hard, Josh, he'd say with a smirk. You might burn yourself out. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that his insecurities weren't my problem. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just harmless teasing. Ryan was angling for something, though I didn't know what. For the time being, I pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the work. There was still so much to do, and I wasn't going to let Ryan's antics distract me. By the end of the second year, the company was a completely different entity. We had gone from the brink of collapse to being a leader in our industry. Clients who had once written us off were now singing our praises, and employees who had feared for their jobs were thriving in their roles. It should have felt like a victory, and in some ways, it did. But in the back of my mind, there was always this nagging sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan wasn't done causing problems, and that when he made his move, it wouldn't be subtle. By the third year, the company had transformed into something I could genuinely be proud of. We weren't just surviving, We were thriving. Revenue was climbing steadily, and we'd broken into several new markets, securing contracts I wouldn't have even dreamed of when I first stepped in. Our name, once associated with broken promises and inefficiency, now carried weight again. It felt like the years of sacrifice were finally paying off. But with success came new pressures. The company's growth had put us on the radar of competitors, and I found myself navigating challenges on multiple fronts. New deals required intricate negotiations, and every decision seemed to carry greater weight. I threw myself into the work, determined to maintain our upward trajectory. And then there was Ryan. If he'd been a thorn in my side before, now he was a full-blown obstacle. As the company grew, so did his involvement, or at least the appearance of it. He started showing up to every major meeting, inserting himself into conversations he clearly didn't understand. He'd interrupt with half-baked suggestions or try to take credit for ideas he hadn't even heard of until moments before. It was exhausting. What made it worse was how Dad encouraged him. No matter how much I accomplished, Ryan was always positioned as the prodigal son, the future leader of the company. "He's got great instincts," Dad would say, as if that somehow made up for the fact that Ryan barely lifted a finger. I'd smile and nod, knowing there was no point arguing. Dad's blind spot for Ryan wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Ryan's need to be in the spotlight meant he started making promises to clients without consulting anyone. I'd walk into meetings only to discover that Ryan had agreed to terms we couldn't possibly meet or timelines that were completely unrealistic. Cleaning up his messes became a full-time job on top of my actual responsibilities. One particular incident stands out. We were in the middle of negotiating a lucrative deal with a major client. It had taken months to get them on board, and the final contract was nearly ready. Then Ryan, in his infinite wisdom, decided to call the client directly. He promised them additional services, ones we hadn't even discussed internally, at no extra cost. By the time I found out, the client was already celebrating their great deal. I confronted Ryan immediately. "What the hell were you thinking?" I demanded. He shrugged, leaning back in his chair like he didn't have a care in the world. "I was just trying to seal the deal. You're welcome, by the way." "Welcome?" I repeated, incredulous. "Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost us?" "It's an investment," he said dismissively. "You're always talking about the big picture, right?" I wanted to scream. Instead, I took a deep breath and walked out. Fixing Ryan's mistakes had become part of the job, and no amount of yelling was going to change that. As frustrating as it was, I still believed in what I was doing. The company's success wasn't just about numbers. It was about proving that I could build something lasting, something that mattered. Every new milestone felt like a small victory, even if Ryan and Dad refused to acknowledge it. But beneath the surface, tensions were boiling over. Ryan's resentment toward me was growing more obvious by the day. He hated that I was the one driving the company's success, even if he wouldn't admit it outright. And I couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something. That feeling turned out to be more than just paranoia. One day, out of the blue, Dad called an emergency shareholders meeting. He wouldn't tell me what it was about, but his tone was serious. I spent the night before going over every possible scenario, trying to figure out what was going on. I thought maybe it was a big acquisition or a major policy change. Something important but manageable. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I walked into the boardroom the next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. Ryan was already there, looking far too smug for my liking. Dad sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. The meeting started like any other. Dad gave a brief overview of the company's progress, praising our recent successes. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally going to acknowledge my contributions. And then he dropped the bombshell. "Effective immediately," Dad announced. "Ryan will be stepping into the role of CEO." It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. Ryan? CEO? The same Ryan who had done nothing but ride on the company's coattails for years? It didn't make any sense. "Dad," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "what are you talking about?" He looked at me with something almost like pity. "You've done an incredible job, Josh, truly. But Ryan has the leadership qualities we need to take this company to the next level." "Leadership qualities?" I wanted to laugh. Ryan didn't know the first thing about running a company. He could barely manage his own life, let alone an entire organization. Ryan, for his part, looked like the cat that got the cream. He leaned back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Don't take it personally, little brother," he said. "It's just business. Just business." The phrase echoed in my head as I sat there, stunned. Everything I had worked for, every late night, every sacrifice, it all felt like it had been for nothing. I didn't argue, I didn't yell, I didn't even cry. I just stood up, nodded, and walked out. There was nothing left to say, Walking out of that shareholders meeting felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart from the outside. My hands were shaking, but I kept my head high. I wasn't about to give Ryan or Dad the satisfaction of seeing me break. But inside I was a storm of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. I went straight to my office, closed the door, and just sat there, staring at the walls, at the files on my desk, at the notes about ongoing projects. I realized all of it would soon belong to Ryan. The thought was like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a job to me. It was my life, my purpose. And now, it was being handed over to someone who hadn't earned it, someone who didn't care about it the way I did. I spent the rest of the day tying up loose ends. I knew I couldn't stay. There was no way I could work under Ryan, watching him dismantle everything I'd built piece by piece. So, I started drafting my resignation letter. It was short and to the point. Effective immediately, I was stepping down from my role. No explanations, no dramatics, just the facts. When I handed the letter to Dad later that evening, he looked genuinely surprised. "You don't have to do this, Josh," he said, his voice almost pleading. "There's still a place for you here." "A place for me? Under Ryan's thumb? No thanks." "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Dad," I said, keeping my tone steady. "But I can't be here anymore. Not like this." He sighed heavily, but he didn't try to argue. I think on some level he knew this was inevitable. As I packed up my things, a few of my colleagues stopped by to say goodbye. Some of them were shocked, others just sad. "You're the reason we're still here, Josh," one of them said. "It's not going to be the same without you." I didn't have the heart to tell them that it wouldn't be the same without me. It would be worse. I knew Ryan well enough to know that he wasn't equipped to handle the pressures of leadership. He'd coast along on my successes for a while, but when the cracks started to show, he wouldn't know how to fix them. And Dad? He'd probably sweep in to clean up the mess, just like he always did. The next few weeks were a blur. I spent most of my time trying to figure out what came next. Starting over wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. No more 16-hour days. No more cleaning up after Ryan. No more fighting for recognition I was never going to get. I thought leaving the company would be the hardest part, but what hurt the most was the silence. Dad barely called, and when he did, the conversations were short and awkward. Ryan didn't bother reaching out at all, not that I expected him to. I felt like I'd been erased from their lives, like all the sacrifices I'd made didn't matter anymore. One night, I was sitting on my couch, scrolling through job postings when my phone buzzed. It was a message from one of my former colleagues. "Thought you should know. Ryan's already undoing half of what you put in place. Morale's down, and a few of the clients you brought back are jumping ship." I stared at the screen, a mix of anger and vindication washing over me. Part of me wanted to storm back into that office and fix everything, but the larger part of me knew it wasn't my problem anymore. They had made their choice. Now they had to live with it. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding my life. I took some consulting gigs, using the skills I'd honed to help other struggling businesses. It wasn't the same as running my dad's company, but it was fulfilling in its own way. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny, but the past has a way of catching up with you. About 6 months after I left, I got a call from Dad. It was late, and his voice sounded tired, defeated even. "Josh," he said, "I think I made a mistake." I didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. "The company's not doing well," he admitted. He's not handling things the way I thought he would. I need your help." There it was. The moment I'd dreamed of and dreaded all at once. Part of me wanted to say no, to remind him that he'd chosen Ryan over me. But another part of me, the part that still cared about the company and the people who worked there, couldn't just turn my back. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But if I come back, things have to be different." Dad hesitated, and I could tell he didn't like the idea of giving up control. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, no more playing favorites," I said. "If I'm going to fix this, I need to be the one in charge. No interference, no second guessing." There was a long pause. Finally, he sighed. I'll talk to Ryan." That was the last thing I wanted to hear. "You do that," I said, and then I hung up. I wasn't going to hold my breath. I didn't hear back from Dad for weeks after that phone call. I assumed he'd talked to Ryan, and as expected, nothing had changed. If anything, I figured Ryan had probably doubled down, convinced he could handle everything on his own. Part of me felt a strange sense of closure. I had given them a chance, and if they didn't want to take it, that was their choice. I was finally free to move forward without looking back. In the meantime, I kept busy with my consulting work. Helping other companies felt like a way to channel everything I'd learned over the years. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Each project was a reminder that I was capable, that my hard work hadn't been in vain. I wasn't just the guy who saved a sinking ship. I was someone who could build something meaningful from the ground up, no matter the odds. But then, out of nowhere, Dad called again. This time, his voice sounded even more strained than before. "Josh," he said without preamble, "I need you to come to the office." "What's going on?" I asked, already bracing myself for the answer. "It's Ryan," he said with a heavy sigh. "He's made some questionable decisions. We've lost a couple of key clients, and morale is at an all-time low. The board is starting to get restless." I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. "Dad, I told you what my conditions were. Has anything changed?" There was a pause, and then quietly he said, "Yes, Ryan's agreed to step down." That caught me off guard. Ryan? Stepping down? It didn't seem possible. "And you're okay with this?" I asked. "I don't have a choice," Dad admitted. "We're running out of options." I told him I'd think about it and hung up. The truth was, I didn't need time to decide. I knew I was going back. As much as I wanted to stay angry, as much as I wanted to hold on to my pride, I couldn't. This company wasn't just a business to me. It was a legacy. It was my father's life's work, and whether I liked it or not, it was part of mine too. When I walked back into the office a few days later, it felt like stepping into a time machine. Not much had changed on the surface, but the atmosphere was completely different. The energy I'd worked so hard to build was gone, replaced by a sense of unease. People greeted me with a mix of relief and trepidation, as if they weren't sure whether to celebrate my return or brace for another upheaval. My first meeting with the board was tense. They wanted answers. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? I didn't waste time pointing fingers. Instead, I laid out a plan to stabilize the company and rebuild trust with our clients. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew it was possible. I'd done it before, and I could do it again. As for Ryan, our interactions were brief and professional. He avoided eye contact during the handover process, and I didn't push him. There was no point in rehashing old wounds. I was there to fix the company, not to relive the drama. Over the next several months, I threw myself back into the work. It was exhausting, but also invigorating. I renegotiated contracts, brought back clients who had left, and implemented new policies to rebuild employee morale. Slowly but surely, the company began to recover. One of the most surprising moments came during a conversation with Dad. We were sitting in his office late one evening, going over the latest financial reports. For the first time in a long time, the numbers were trending in the right direction. "You've done good work, Josh," he said, breaking the silence. I looked up, startled. Compliments from Dad were rare, to say the least. "Thanks," I said cautiously, waiting for the inevitable "but." "I mean it," he continued. "I should have seen it sooner. You're the one who kept this company alive, not Ryan. I don't know why it took me so long to admit it, but I'm proud of you." Those words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I'd been chasing Dad's approval, telling myself I didn't need it, while secretly craving it. Hearing him say he was proud of me felt like a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying had been lifted. "Thanks, Dad," I said quietly, not trusting myself to say more. As the company continued to grow, I started thinking about the future, not just for the business, but for myself. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life cleaning up other people's messes. I wanted to create something that was entirely mine, something I could look back on with pride. So, I made a decision. Once the company was stable enough to run without me, I would step away for good. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt like the right one. I'd given everything I had to this business, and now it was time to see what else I could do. When I finally shared my plans with Dad, he didn't argue. "You've earned it," he said simply. "Just don't forget where you came from." "I won't," I promised, and I meant it. Looking back on everything, I realized that saving the company wasn't just about keeping my dad's dream alive. It was about proving something to myself, that I was capable, that I could take on the impossible and come out stronger on the other side. And as I prepared to take the next step in my journey, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Walking away from the company for the second time was different. This time, it wasn't about anger or betrayal. It was about peace. I knew I'd done everything I could to stabilize and grow the business, and I was finally leaving on my own terms. Before I stepped away, Dad and I had one last meaningful conversation. It was late one evening, and we were sitting in his office, much like that night years ago when I promised to save the company. "You're really going to leave this time?" Dad asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "Yeah," I said. "It's time for me to build something of my own." He nodded slowly, staring out the window. "I always thought I'd pass this company down to Ryan," he admitted. "I guess I was wrong about a lot of things." I stayed quiet, letting him work through his thoughts. "I'm glad it was you," he continued. You didn't just save the company, you made it better. You built something I never could have imagined. I'm proud of you, son. Those words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had quietly craved his approval, even as I told myself I didn't need it. Hearing him say he was proud of me felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders, one I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. Thanks, Dad, I said simply, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we truly understood each other. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change. I took time to travel, reconnect with old friends, and rediscover what it felt like to live without the constant weight of responsibility. It was strange at first, waking up without an endless to-do list or going to bed without the stress of a major decision looming over me. But slowly, I adjusted. As the company thrived under its new leadership, I began to dream about building something of my own. I wanted to take everything I'd learned, the mistakes, the victories, the late nights, and channel it into a new venture. Partnering with a few trusted friends, I launched a business that reflected my vision and values, a project I could truly call my own. Looking back, the journey wasn't easy. There were countless sacrifices, relationships that suffered, and moments when I doubted myself. But every setback taught me something valuable: resilience, humility, and the importance of staying true to your goals, no matter how daunting they seem. I don't talk to Ryan much these days, and that's okay. He's on his own path, and I've made my peace with how things turned out. Dad and I stay in touch more often now. Our relationship isn't perfect, but there's mutual respect, and that's enough for me. And as for the company, it's thriving. Watching it grow beyond anything I could have imagined is bittersweet but satisfying. I know I left it in good hands, built on a foundation of hard work and perseverance. In the end, saving my dad's company wasn't just about keeping his dream alive. It was about proving something to myself, that I could take something broken and make it whole again, that I could rise to the challenge, even when the odds were stacked against me. It's not about the accolades or the recognition. It's about knowing you gave it everything you had, that you did the best you could with what you were given. And for me, that's more than enough. This single, cohesive version ties everything together while maintaining the emotional depth and finality. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to adjust.